and welcome to Code Corner with Dan Decker, the podcast. I'm your host, Nicole Hickman, the engineering manager for Midwest Alarm Services. Today, we're continuing to dive into the nitty-gritty of the International Building Code with our very own Industry Affairs Manager, Dan Decker. Dan, in our last episode, you talked about the importance of occupancy classifications. What's next on our agenda?
Well, so far we have covered Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3 with the occupancy classifications, and now we're going to look at Chapter 4, which is special occupancies. There's some very detailed requirements for specific occupancies. So Chapter 9 covers a lot of general stuff. Chapter 4 deals with some things that are only found in Chapter 4. For example, Section 402 deals with covered and open mall buildings. So if you've got a facility that has a total floor area, or the space of the outside mall is over 50,000 square feet, the mall must have an emergency voice alarm communication system. We also always recommend that the mall's fire alarm system serve the tenant spaces. That way you've got consistent signaling and messages throughout the entire area. We've done some malls, and that's always a challenge to have a tenant move in and put in their standard fire alarm system and then try and integrate that with the mall that has voice evacuation systems. And most of the time, if the mall management is aware of it up front, it just makes sense to have the mall system extended for the tenant space.
So what about anchor stores in the mall? Do they fall under those same rules?
They don't. From looking at it, you would think that an anchor store is clearly part of the mall, but the code actually distinguishes between tenant stores and anchor stores, and they base it on whether they've got their own exits, which kind of makes sense when you think about it. So an anchor store will have its own entrance separate from the mall. It may have an entrance to the mall, but it's independently has its own entrances and exits. A tenant space, usually the only way you can access and leave a tenant store is through the mall space. So that's why there's greater coverage on that. It's kind of like a hallway with bedrooms in a residence. The mall is kind of the corridor that connects everything.
Gotcha. What's the next occupancy?
The next one up on the list is Section 403, which covers high-rise buildings. The code defines a high-rise building as a building with an occupied floor that is more than 75 feet above, and this is a phrase that's used a lot in the code, the lowest level of fire department access. Normally, you just measure from the ground up, but there are buildings that are built into hills, and sometimes the fire department can access it from the high side so they can actually get somewhat higher. I'm not sure. I'm sure there's a technical reason for using that, but generally a building level is about 10 feet per level. And so if you've got a building with 8 or more floors, that's usually considered a high rise. A 7-story building is usually not considered a high rise. I think you started your career in Michigan too. And Michigan for quite a few years modified this definition and said that it was 55 feet, which basically made a 6-story building as high as you could go without becoming a high rise. So it's always was interesting in Michigan when out-of-state architects would come in and plop in a 7-story building, thinking they were just under the requirements for a high rise, and they were actually in high rise requirements in Michigan. They modified that with the last code adoption. So that's a historical fact, not something we have to deal with today.
Well, those are fun facts. But what are the special rules for high rises?
High rises are unique because you can't just go to the exit and leave. People have to use stairs or elevators to exit the building in a high rise. And so they have some specific requirements for high rises, including a fire alarm system. They identify specific locations that we have to install smoke detectors, such as elevator equipment rooms, electrical rooms, power rooms if they've got doing anything with emergency power. And emergency voice alarm communications are required, as well as two-way emergency responder radio coverage. So it's an elevated level of safety because there's an elevated level of risk. The code actually requires notification on the floor originating the alarm, the floor above, and the floor below, and that becomes progressively more important the higher the building gets, because you don't want to overtax the stairways. So if you've got a 9-story building and you evacuate the entire building, not a huge deal because the stairways can generally accommodate that. But if you've got a 20-story building, they want to limit the number of floors that are in alarm at one time so that people aren't backed up in the stairways trying to leave the building.
So are stairways on their own zone?
The stairways are really treated completely independently. They've got 2-hour protection. They've generally got their own ventilation, and they generally don't have initiating devices in the stairway. That's kind of determined to be a safe spot in terms of smoke migration. They generally pressurize the stairways so that if you open a stairway door on a floor that's got smoke, the air will push out from the stairway and prevent smoke from getting in it. They do put them on their own zones for evacuation. So if you've got fire situation going on and people are trapped in a stairway, the incident commander can pick up a microphone and address that particular stairway. So they may have a situation where they want them to evacuate towards the roof based on what is happening down below, and that way they can select one or more stairways and say, you folks need to go up the stairs rather than exit at the ground level.
That makes a lot of sense. What about atriums? They always seem pretty complex to me.
I think they are for the code too, because they can't decide when an atrium is an atrium. Section 404 addresses atrium, and they're technically vertical spaces that connect 2 or more stories in certain medical and correctional facilities, but then in other occupancies, it's 3 or more stories. So it kind of waffles between connecting 2 stories or 3 stories, depending on the occupancy. But where you've got an atrium, generally, you've got fire separations between the floors. So every floor separates you from the floor above, and so that makes a natural fire barrier. But an atrium that combines multiple floors obviously does not have any fire barrier at that point. So they look for an alternate way to deal with that. So atriums require a fire alarm with a smoke control feature, and by smoke control, that's the ability to turn on exhaust fans, open up dampers, or open up doors to bring in replacement air so that smoke can be exhausted out of the building. Additionally, if the atrium is in an assembly, educational, or mercantile building, it also has to have an emergency voice alarm communication systems, kind of for the same reasons we did them for high rises.
So what are some of the other occupancies covered in Chapter 4?
Well, we've got specific rules for I2, which is medical care, and I3, which is correctional occupancies. Both of them require a fire alarm system, and both have specific locations where we have to provide smoke detectors. There's also something called special amusement areas, which I think of as the Halloween buildings that you go through where you're supposed to be scared.
Like haunted houses?
Yeah, that sort of thing. Those are called special amusement areas. And if they have an occupant load of 50 or more, they need both automatic smoke detection and an emergency voice alarm system. We also have air traffic control towers, which are a real specific form of a high rise. They require automatic smoke detection and emergency voice communication systems if the control cab is over 75 feet high. And then last, there's a H occupancy for high hazards, and they give you levels of whatever particular hazard that you are dealing with. There's maximum levels, and if you exceed what they call the maximum allowable quantity, then you have to put in an emergency alarm, and those alarms are initiated manually and can be tied to a monitoring station as well.
That's a lot of details just in Chapter 4, Dan. This has been incredibly insightful. It's clear that understanding Chapter 4 is crucial for anyone working in the fire and life safety industry. Thank you for your time and expertise.
My pleasure, Nicole. Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for listening to Code Corner with Dan Decker, the podcast. Join us for our next chapter as we continue our tour of the building code, covering chapters 5 through 8. We'll see you then.